So, good. That pleasurable housekeeping done. Let me open this third science colloquium. The science colloquium it's a curious entity. It is named in the most, how could I say, banal and downplaying mode possible, because it's not meant to be an event that is imposing in any sense. Rather, it's meant to be quite open and quite experimental. This is also why you don't find a program with carefully demarcated lectures and so forth, because the idea is to have good quality presentations, but to do this in something of a conversational space. And it is meant to be, I want to retain something of the improvisational character of this, because we want to make this conversation possible. So we just changed the schedule a few moments ago again, and that's just according to feeling, how this might go. And so I hope that everyone will feel, as a potential participant, to feel able to engage this conversation. We have some formidable expertise in the room, but that doesn't mean that in our cross-disciplinary space there can't be an engagement to which everyone is invited. So it's a hybrid entity. It's like a seminar, it's like a colloquium, but most importantly, it's a cross-disciplinary conversation where we're invited to do our best to think together about topics that are very timely. But what I mean by this is that the European Graduate School has functioned within a kind of horizon defined by continental philosophy and the kinds of art and literature that theorists and philosophers in that vein have attended to in the past 4 or 5 decades. So it has something of a school quality, but we are at the same time trying to open constantly to events elsewhere both in the socio-political world, but in the intellectual world. And it's been my sense for some time that it's really very important that we open to the sciences and try to engage some of the really, critically important events that are going on in scientific research, and try to think with the sciences about thought itself and the practice of thought. So the very first colloquium 2 years ago was on this topic of thought and science. Last year we had a discussion of artificial intelligence with a group from Google. This year our topic is time. It's meant to be a very open topic to engage various possibilities, unexpected possibilities, and also unusual forms. So let me take that as our official title. I like that better than anything we've had so far. Unusual forms of time. And with that, let me introduce Jean-Michel Sananskis, who comes to us from Paris. It's very exciting to be able to welcome him today. And we will continue, I believe, as we have agreed. Ellie will follow Jean-Michel after a discussion, and we'll simply see how long that discussion goes. In the early afternoon, then I will present something which touches upon rhythm. And then later in the afternoon, Xin-Wei will get the final word on that same topic and on rhythm. But obviously, we're taking things in very different ways, and we hope that this will open an interesting space, I suppose, between the formal and the phenomenological, if I could put it that way. So, with that, let me give the floor to Jean-Michel and welcome all of you and thank all of you for making it today.
First point, Ellie's PhD was less than 600 pages. It's already about time. So here is the general structure of the talk. And now I was told by Ellie that our topic was non-standard temporality. So I thought that if we want to present non-standard ways of time, we have to decide what is the standard way of time. And I think there is an obvious best candidate. It would be a vision of time which is at the same time the vision of common sense and the vision of mathematical physics, of classical mathematical physics, at least. It's the conception of time as irreversible, which means that we are in the Heraclitean tradition, and also as continuous, which I want to make this point more precise. When I say that time in the standard conception is supposed to be continuous, I mean that it enfolds a continuous richness. Continuum is the name of a kind of multiplicity, and from Aristotle we know that a continuum as a kind of multiplicity is a very rich multiplicity. It's a multiplicity which is so coherent and which holds to itself so strongly that we cannot separate things, we cannot isolate points, and the result is that there is a huge quantity of points and parts. So that would be the standard way of time. And as I said, we often consider that this is the way common sense sees time. And when Cantor and Dedekind at the end of the 19th century invented the famous structure R, structure of the real line, they thought that they had discovered the mathematical expression of this common sense intuition, tracing back to Aristotle and the Greeks. And Dedekind writes that, he writes it down in an explicit way. He says, this structure that I am presenting you, it's what everybody always thought to be the continuum without knowing what they meant. So I'm going to try to expound and discuss variations with respect to this standard. And I could rephrase my description of the standard by saying that it is the standard of time as Heraclitean continuous flow. And I like this formulation because, it was Husserl's formulation. And I could also add that a part of the work of Hilbert was to characterize this theory of continuum space, in his case, and as optimal in some theoretical sense. So a first way to depart from our standard is to decide that time is going to be discrete. We keep the irreversible property, but now time is going to be discrete. So if we think of the mathematical translation, it means that we would switch from R to N being the set of natural numbers. And but I'm always interested in existence, Maybe you don't know, but you are going to realize. And so I think I want to give existential substance to this model of irreversible discrete time. And the best way to do so for me is to say that it is the time of formal deduction. We have a contemporary notion of formal proof, which was given to us by Hilbert again, but it traces back very far in the past. So what we call a formal proof is a text which is a list of formulas, and each formula is either an axiom or the result of applying an inference rule to previous lines in the text. So there is a notion of the past. You cannot apply a rule but to the past. The text is a temporally ongoing text, and when you apply an inference rule, it has to work on already written lines, so lines of the past in the text. So that's the notion of formal proof, and this is an irreversible linear time, but not continuous, because it goes step by step, and we can label the steps with a natural number. So the structure of this proof as a temporal object is at least comes from the set of the structure of the natural numbers. It's a finite part of the structure of the natural numbers. So I'm speaking about the time of proving, and I want to make a first point because we are interested in non-standard in general. I have just said that the structure of the formal proof was a linear irreversible structure, but it doesn't have to be so, because if we define a formal proof with the theory of natural deduction due to Pravits, then a proof would rather be a proof tree, not a linear text, but a proof tree. So the corresponding discrete irreversible time would not be exactly the same. Instead of having a discrete irreversible time just going down in a linear way, we would have a discrete irreversible time with branches, but these branches would converge to reach the present. So I give you an example of two presentations of the same proof. Is the proof of this formula, which maybe it's not going to speak to you. A entails P entails Q, entails. A entails P, entails. A entails Q. So it's not going to speak to you, but it's a very classical guy. When you use the lambda calcul code for that proof, it gives you the famous Curie operator S. So it's a very good friend of people working in that field. So it's like Trump for American politics, you know. I hope I have made it familiar. And that's why I called the formula T, you know. And so here is the linear presentation of the proof. So if you are a bit interested in natural deduction, the indexes 1, 2, or 3 are indexes of the assumptions, because when you are writing down a proof following natural deduction system, you make assumptions, and then you have to discharge your assumptions. It's a game, because you are trying to prove eternal logical truths. So eternal logical truths should not depend on assumptions. But the game is that you introduce assumptions and then you delete them, so to say, you discharge them. So it's shown in the picture. So that's the linear form. But then here is the same proof, but in a tree form. So you see that the end is exactly the same, but at the beginning, in the tree form, you can see branches and converging branches. So if we are only speaking about, for example, natural deduction, classical intuitionist or minimal, one can prove that we don't need to keep the tree form. We can always translate the tree form into the linear form. And from what I have read many years ago, it could be different in the context of something quite technical, which is called proof nets, and which has been developed by the school of Girard. Nothing more about that, just so our idea is that we have a non-standard form of time, which is the irreversible discrete form, and inside this irreversible discrete form, we would have the alternative between a branching version and a linear version. But in most cases, it's the same. So now I come to the preferred moment of my talk. It's where I tell you the story of In Samarkand Tonight. It's a story which I've discovered when I was very young, watching TV, because there is a French playwright who wrote a drama based on this story, and it's this story, the story I'm going to tell you, and at the same time it's a love story, the drama of our playwright. So all conditions were together to make it impress me for my whole life. And so what is the story of In Samarkand Tonight? So I've looked on the internet to find English versions of that, and in the English version I have found the story is about a merchant. So I'm not going to take this version with the merchant. I'm going to keep my usual version, which is about a prince or a vizier. Vizier is possible in English? Okay. So it's a young vizier, and he is living in Persia, and he's in Isfahan at noon, and he's maybe buying things on the market. So it connects with the merchant. But he sees a woman with black clothes coming to him, and he recognizes this woman to be the death. So he decides that he's not going, he avoids to meet her. So he escapes, and he decides to go to Samarkand. And in the evening in Samarkand, he meets again the same woman, and she says, I was so surprised to see you in Isfahan at noon, because I knew that we were supposed to meet in Samarkand tonight. So you see, the idea is the story for me is that we have, connected with the story, you have a kind of modal conception of time, where you have many futures which are parallel, so to say, but then the idea of in Samarkand Tonight is that maybe in every branch, after a first step, you find Samarkand after this first step. Maybe you can vary the first step, but then you are going to find Samarkand again. So I can make that technical, because maybe, I don't know, a big event in contemporary logic was when Kripke discovered that it was possible to define semantics in the Tarskian style for modal logic on the one hand, and for intuitionist logic on the other hand. And according to these new semantics introduced by Kripke, intuitionist logic and modal logic could be shown to be complete, like first-order classical logic. And so I focus on intuitionist logic. If you have heard already about intuitionist logic, you probably know that in intuitionist logic, P entails not P, but it's not true that not P entails P, which we formulate in mathematical language by saying that negation, according to intuitionist logic, is not involutive. And for a philosopher, it's quite common, because we know that according to Hegel, logic is not involutive, because negation of something, you don't recover the something you began with. So, but yes?
If I'm not married, I'm not necessarily married.
Yes, the statement that it is not true that you are married. From that, you cannot conclude that you are married. And so, how do we establish that with Kripke semantics? The idea, it looks like technical on my slide, but I'm going to tell you the story, and my hope is that you are going to find it crystal clear. So when you are evaluating propositions in Kripke semantics, you don't evaluate a proposition in the world. There is not only one world. In common sense notion of truth, if I say it is raining in our room, you verify, you compare the meaning of my sentence with this ongoing situation in the room, and you conclude that when I was saying it is raining in this room, I was making a false statement. So you compare your proposition with the world. There is only one world, and to know whether the statement is true or not, you compare with the world. But then if you are in Kripke semantics, you don't have only one world. You have a graph of worlds. And every world leads to other worlds which are extensions of the first world. You have a world, and then a bit farther an extension of that world, and maybe two other extensions of this second world I just named, and so on. So you have a graph of worlds. And when you say, and the semantics of not is that to say that not P is true on some world means that in no future on that world, in no extension of that world, P is going to be true. So when you say not P, you don't engage only with respect to the actual world, but you are only allowed to consider not P as established, if not only P is not true now, but if P is never going to be true in extensions of your world. So if you use that rule, you see that to say that not P is true in some world means that for every future of your world, there is a future of that future where P is going to hold. While when you say that P is true in the world, W, it means that P is now true and is going to be true in every future of W. So when you have P, it means that you have P at your world W and in all the futures of W. When you have not P, it means that for every future of your world W, there is a future of that future where P is going to be true. So you see that the status of not P is in Samarkand Tonight. When we say that not P is true, it means that in every future, we are going to meet as a future of this future P, as a kind of destiny. We cannot avoid P. We can choose every branch of the future at our point. We are going to recover to meet P after our first choice. So it's again, you know, this form of time in Samarkand Tonight. You may choose your first step, but then you meet what was supposed to be met. So another version of that is every path leads to Rome. I think you know that, and we all understand that every path leads. What we mean when we say every path leads to Rome is more or less that you may begin with your travel in any possible way. You may decide that you go to Madrid, or maybe you may decide that you go to Beijing, or that you go to Santiago in Chile. But necessarily after, at some point, you are going to go to Rome. So it's again in Samarkand Tonight. And there is the French writer Jacques Rigaud, who was part of the Dadaist movement. But he was not the leader of that movement, but some say that he was the real star, the unknown star. You know, I had a friend who recently died, Thierry Séchant. He was the brother of a famous French singer. And he used to say that in every big group of artists or intellectuals, there is a guy who is the secret superstar. Other guys in the group are much more famous than him, but he is the real star. And so, according to him, Jacques Rigaud was the real star of the Dadaist movement. And I think that some people think that in the surrealist movement, Desnos was the secret superstar. And so there are, and in the case of the beatnik movement, it's Richard Breutigam, according to my friend. So, end of it's not necessary for the content, but it helps. And Jacques Rigaud said that every path leads to Rome is a word play, but it's only a word play in French, because Rome, it's inverted letters with mort. So he was saying that it was really in Samarkand Tonight, because in Samarkand Tonight you meet death. And we could consider that the Heidegger's conception of Sein zum Tode is in some way following the scheme of In Samarkand Tonight, because the great idea of Sein zum Tode is that each time I project, the Dasein projects, the futurizing gesture of Dasein, it's always taken from a global projection, which is the projection unto death. So in a way, every first projection, which we can picture as contingent, always leads to the ultimate projection of all our possible, and which is the projections towards death. But surprisingly, you can also interpret along the same scheme of In Samarkand Tonight, Levinas' notion of delaying. I don't know what's, maybe you are going to tell me. What's the English translation of ajournement in Levinas? I have tried delaying, but
Postponing?
It could be postponing. You're right.
Surely that would be the way.
Yeah. Okay. Postponing maybe. So Levinas says it's a passage in Totality and Infinity where Levinas discusses history as a figure of totality, and he says that from the point of view of history, every human life is finished. History comes after living trajectories, and history tries to make a complete inventory of everything which has been done and to extract causes, trends, and so on. But it presupposes that we are after the battle. So, and Levinas say that's not the correct point of view concerning human life. Human life is always lived in the mode of the postponing, which means, I think, if we analyze this idea as we always live in the postponing, it means that we are always projecting a future beyond which we see another future. We are never projecting a future as the ultimate future. Our way of living in a human way time is to project a future which has itself a future. So you see, it's funny, you have Rigaud's pessimism, Heidegger's totalizing, set theorizing conception of the possible, which we gather in a totality, and then we have Levinas' conception, which is completely antithetic from the two first ones, but still we have at each time the scheme of In Samarkand Tonight. I can add, for people who are interested in that this formal scheme of beyond any initial path, that would be the formulation of In Samarkand Tonight, plays a very important role in various versions of forcing in mathematics. You know, because forcing has become, along the years, a very multifaceted object or method. People have invented a lot of variants of forcing, and now it's a huge topic. And you have constructive versions of forcing, you have category theoretic versions of forcing, you have model theoretic versions of forcing, and so on. And inside each possibility, various sub-possibilities. But in many of them, you find this In Samarkand Tonight form, scheme. For example, in model theoretic version of forcing given by Robinson, or in a constructive transposition of forcing proposed by Beeson. So I'm wondering, is In Samarkand Tonight a standard or a non-standard discrete form of time? I have no answer, but I think it's interesting to raise the question. If we decided that we are going to accept this irreversible discrete structure of time, has time for us to include this In Samarkand Tonight scheme or not? What is standard, what is not standard?
Can you say a little bit about what you think standard means? To say something is standard, to say the model is standard?
I said that discrete is not standard. in general, because my first point was that the standard picture of time is the continuous irreversible form. But then let us decide that we have chosen the discrete irreversible form. Then inside with what is non-standard, there is a new standard. Do we have a standard of this non-standard discrete irreversible time? And if we have a standard of this non-standard irreversible discrete time, is it a standard with in Samarkand Tonight scheme or not?
But the scheme itself, is it possible to transpose it to a continuous format?
But you don't.
You need the steps, and so
yes, wow.
To apply the scheme and reason in modal terms upon time.
Yes, you could try. It's also a way of dealing with the issue. You can try to. You need steps, but then you can decide that your steps are going to be paths. And so you could say that you have an equivalent of in Samarkand Tonight, when there is something such that for every first path there is a way to extend the first path, and you are going to reach the destination. Maybe so, and then you could, if you want to be to make things sexy, you are going to try to formulate that in a homotopy type theory, and then you are in the center of the fashion. So why not?
But nevertheless, the feeling from what you're saying, the feeling I get is, so even if you do that, you're still ultimately relying on an intuition which is discrete, because you need to enumerate the path or to index them somehow, and so it's already discrete in some sense.
I think the idea of step it comes from the discrete, but you can try to make sense of steps in the continuum environment. But then maybe the problem with mathematics is that you have always in mathematics inversion of the grounding and the grounded. So probably some mathematician is going to make me wrong, and to prove that to write down a theory where the continuous notion of path comes first and step is defined after. So, but as philosophers, we may resist that. So a second part of the talk, alternative continuum. I said that the standard conception of time is the continuous irreversible time for structure for time. But then continuous structure of time, maybe it has a non-standard alternative, because I said it in my introduction. For me, the continuum is the structure which was defined by Cantor and Dedekind. But then mathematicians are able to design alternative versions of the continuum, and it's exactly what happened with non-standard analysis or non-standard mathematics. And we can do that first using what is called star n, which is the enlargement of the set of natural numbers. Enlargement is a notion which was introduced by Robinson. Robinson said, you are usually doing mathematics in such and such framework, but it's always possible to enlarge the framework. And to enlarge the framework is to make the framework accept all ideal objects with respect to the basis framework. Robinson says very often we have mathematical frameworks, and inside these frameworks we see that we may conceive ideal objects standing at the horizon. But these ideal objects standing at the horizon in our basic framework, we don't have them, they don't exist in the framework. But if we enlarge the framework is going to be enriched by all the possible ideal objects. They are going to be added to the framework. So he does that with natural numbers, and this means that you have the standard natural numbers 0, 1, 2, n, and so on, going to the infinite, the potential infinite. But in the enlarged structure, you also have natural numbers like alpha, and alpha is going to be a natural number, and because it is a natural number, it plays the role of a finite numbers, because in our ordinary picture, all natural numbers are finite. So this natural number alpha is going to behave like a finite number, but still he is beyond all standard numbers, which means he's greater than any usual standard finite number. So this is an infinitely large number because it's greater than all usual standard numbers, but at the same time it behaves like a finite number. That's the great idea of Robinson. We may cast as playing the role of a finite number something which for real is infinite. So we have this alpha beyond the standard numbers, but then we can, with alpha, we can consider 2 times alpha, 3 times alpha, and so on, and n times alpha. So we have a new series of the multiples of alpha. So it's a series of very, very big numbers because alpha is already infinitely large. But in the new framework of star n, the enlarged natural numbers framework, there is a beta which is beyond all the n alpha. So we had first an alpha beyond all the standard usual numbers, and then we have a beta beyond all the multiples of alpha. So we made 2 leaps. First, we were following the series of the standard numbers, and we jumped to alpha, which is greater than all of them. And then we followed the series of the multiples of alpha, and we jumped to beta, which is greater than all the n alpha with n standard. And then we can build a model of the continuum by using fractions, rational numbers, of the form k over alpha, and we allow k to vary from minus beta to beta. So we are going to have a grid because all these rational numbers of the form k over alpha, they build a grid. They are separated. One is separated from the next by a very small segment of length 1 over alpha. So that's the mesh of the grid. And so it's a discrete grid, but the mesh of the discrete grid, because it's 1 over alpha and alpha is infinitely large, it's infinitely small. So we have a discrete grid, but with infinitely small mesh. And then how many numbers do we have? K is allowed to vary from minus beta to beta, so it makes 2 beta plus 1. But beta behaves like a finite number. So in a way, this grid is finite. It behaves as finite. So we have a model of the continuum which is both discrete and finite. And that was, you should feel that as a kind of breakthrough, something impossible becoming possible. We have realized the continuum as discrete and finite. And continuum was felt during centuries as what requires infinity and with what is beyond discrete. And now we have a version of the continuum which is discrete and finite. And we can develop part of analysis in such context, even if it's not going to be always perfectly like in the usual R discourse. So my point is that in this in this non-standard continuum, you replace transcendence by incommensurability. Because I described that we made 2 leaps, the leap from jumping to alpha, and the second leap jumping to beta. And each time we do the jump, but we are unable to compare the quantity we reach at the end of our jump with the quantities which we had before. So we do not know what alpha is with respect to the standard numbers, and we don't know what beta is with respect to the multiples of alpha. We do not control the leap. And this leap can be repeated in arbitrary ways, in an infinite way, in infinitely many arbitrary ways. So we have a picture of the continuum which is realized, so to say, by an infinite multiplicity of scales, and each scale stands beyond other scales in an incommensurable way. There is no number expressing the relation between one scale and the other. So this dispersion of incommensurability is what replaces in this alternative continuum the classical notion of the transcendence of a cardinal of the continuum over the cardinal of the denumerable, which is Aleph 0. So that was my non-standard version of the continuum. And now I come to the third part, and it's a pity because you are extremely tired, but it's the most important part for me because it's the part where I tell you about my philosophy. So I want to speak to you about a non-standard time of subject. And here I'm going to introduce another standard. My first standard was continuum, irreversible time, and Cantor and Dedekind structure. But there is also another standard of time, which is the standard concerning temporization. What is the notion of temporization? I think it's connected with the idea that time does not stand or moves by itself. We don't exactly know what it means, but we say so. We need something to move time. Some primitive action, some strange action is needed for time to proceed. And this action is what we are going to call temporization. And usually, this original action, which brings time into movement, is supported by the subject. And the contemporary version, which makes the standard for us, I think, is the one which has been formalized by Heidegger. And in Heidegger, through an original time, is time as produced by the gesture of Dasein. It's time taking its origin in the gesture of throwing themselves of Dasein. And an important point for Heidegger is that common sense time or mathematical time, this continuous irreversible time I was speaking about in my introduction, is derived with respect with this original temporalization. So I recall Heidegger's scheme. Projection goes in three ways, and these three ways express the essence of time as temporized time. And we have first, Dasein anticipates, projects themselves towards their possibilities, and this gives sense to future. And then we have the idea that Dasein bumps against themselves as already there. I like this picture. You are fiercely going towards your possibilities, and there is a shock. you bumped against yourself as a stupid being in the middle of the world. And so you are not only an ipseity, which is the gesture of throwing. And this gives meaning and status to past. And also, Dasein faces the alternative of authenticity and inauthenticity, which means that either you take responsibility for yourself as a pure throwing, or you misinterpret yourself as one little being with little b among the network of Bedeutsamkeit. And this alternative gives status and meaning to present. So that's the standard. These three basic behaviors build together what is called in Heidegger ecstatic horizontal schema. And that's the original drama of time. As I said, common sense time or continuous model of mathematics and physics is derived from this original drama, according to Heidegger. And last point, Heidegger insists that the futurizing component holds the leading position. It pulls the whole machinery. And then again, Heidegger's discourse has been heard by philosophers after him, and almost all of them, they understood that this story of ecstatic horizontal schema was also implicitly the great story of the openness and indetermination of human practice. In almost all continental philosophers' work I know in contemporary philosophy, you find this celebration of human practice as opening something, but it opens in such a way that we cannot anticipate anything inside which is going to arise inside the opening. So it's the idea of openness and indetermination. And it's not only an ontological description of the original agency of time as supported by the Dasein. It's also the highest value, because in all these philosophical discourses I have implicitly mentioned, the highest value is freedom. And you understand freedom when you understand this openness and this indeterminacy. So it's also the core of moral thinking. And last point, also important, all this discourse has to be compatible with anti-subjectivism, because almost every author I have in mind is at the same time anti-subjectivist. It's true that human subject carries the process, the dynamic of time, because the ecstatic horizontal scheme rests on on Dasein's projections, for example. And in every other version, it rests on the human subject. But the common understanding of contemporary philosophers is that this machinery of the dynamic of time goes through subject, and it overwhelms subject. And ultimately, this rhythm, the rhythm of the three ecstasies, is the rhythm of the disclosure of being with the great B. Ultimately, it's not subjective, even if it goes through us. So that's the standard. And I think that in French phenomenology, they very clearly took up this standard. In Merleau-Ponty and Sartre, you recover the standard. But I think that the philosophers of the moment of structure, and mainly I have in mind the so-called philosophers of difference, I mean Derrida and Deleuze, they are not speaking exactly in phenomenological terms. They don't assume a phenomenological framework, although it would be different in both cases. But you still recover the same story. So I think you have still the openness. You have still the ecstasis. You have still the dynamic of time. Time is grounded in a kind of original dynamic, and this original dynamic coincides with the openness of human practice. Well, I have proposed in my 2007 book, Territoire du Sens, and then in my but then I have reformulated the theory in my 2014 book, Partage du Sens, a completely different way of seeing subject. Because, you know, the big quarrel about subject and against subjectivism and anti-subjectivism, it's always about the anti-subjectivist says that the subjectivist grants too much being to subject. And I think there is a quotation from Lacan which says that at best, you know, it's in the quatrième de couverture, in the back cover of Écrit 2, and Lacan says, I say it in French and then I'm going to try to translate, la fausse évidence dont le sujet se fait titre à parader de l'existence. So the false obviousness according to which the subject claims parades as existing. So you see that the stakes of this anti-subjectivism is that the subject is supposed to believe that he has a lot of being. Subjects see themselves as as owning a great part of being. And anti-subjectivism are going to explain to subjects that they are only a point, a moment, a small region of being process which is larger and comparing with which they are nothing. So that's the quarrel is about being. And so I suggest to consider a subject outside the region of ontology. I don't claim that subject exists, but I claim that we know a tradition inspired by what I call a sollicitator. And a sollicitator is a word meaning a stake, a word which sounds in shared language as transmitting a call. So when we hear the word subject, we can take the word in various ways. We can take the word subject as referring to items in the reality. It's a way of hearing the word subject. But we can also hear the word subject as naming a stake, a call, as expressing a call. So it calls us to the game of subjectivity. A sollicitator is a word which is received as urging demands. And we hear these demands in as much as we wish to raise ourselves to the level of the call of the sollicitator. So in my language, when we hear the call of the sollicitator, we are what I call a follower of the sollicitator. So I take that from Twitter. So you see, subject does not exist, indeed. No problem with that. But we are involved in a game of subjectivity because we are answering the call of the sollicitator subject. So I try, my philosophy, which I call ethoanalysis, says that we should have philosophical inquiries, and these philosophical inquiries try to make explicit the injunctions which are behind the sollicitators. Each time we have a sollicitator, this sollicitator calls us, but calls us to what? And so we have to know what is the game of subjectivity. What do we have to do if we want to behave as subjects? If we want to be at the level of the stakes of subject. Each time we have a sollicitator, we have to formulate a list of injunctions, a list of prescriptions, which are going to be the tables of the law for what I call the ethos. And the ethos is the gathering of all followers. So it's not a real community. It's all people hearing the call of the sollicitator. And so they have something in common, and what they have in common is that they know that they should have to do such and such things if they want to be at the level of the call of the sollicitator. So in my 2007 book, I list many prescriptions which build together what I call, well, in the language of ethoanalysis, it's the sentence, but Elie thinks I should say the sentence, like in English, like in French. But until now, I have said the sentence. So it's the list of the prescriptions which correspond to the call of the sollicitator. The list of prescriptions making the call of the sollicitator explicit. So that's what I call the sentence, or the sentence in French. And so in the book, I list the prescriptions of the game of subjectivity, the tables of the law of the stake of subject. And I mentioned three of them because these three, they are the ones relevant for our issue of temporization. Because I'm going to reach the issue of temporization, don't worry. So the first injunction is what I call the task of identity. I think that as subjects, we are called to build an identity. So, and then let us be clear, personal identity is ontologically false. We have all possibility to verify that we vary and diverge in any possible way. So there is nothing, usually, if you seriously examine the personal history of someone, you discover that there is nothing like an identity. It's too diverse, it's too disunified. But then, it doesn't help us from having to build an identity. We feel that we have to invent an unfolding narrative, attributing its meaningful place to everything we went through. And we do that. We rationalize a personal identity despite this incredible diversity and incompatibility of everything we went through. And I think you could be convinced of what I say if you remember of the moment of hangover after an evening where you used too much. And you remember 5 or 6 things you did while you were so much drinking. And you don't recognize yourself in any of them. And you cannot connect them, or neither. So that's the problem we have all the time but still we are trying, and that's the task of identity. And then I come to way of dealing with time. And you see, I'm not going to try to describe the fundamental gesture of subjects as subjects. I don't try to describe the ontological machinery of temporization in subjects, like Heidegger does, I think. I'm trying to describe how we feel we should manage time as subjects, in as much as we are followers of the sollicitator subject, then we have a specific duty with respect to time. Not a universal duty, and it doesn't derive from our ontological structure, neither from the ontological structure of time. It's part of the game of being a subject, of playing the role, the part of the subject. So, what does it mean to manage time as a subject? I'm going to mention 2 things. First, what I call principle of irresponsibility. So it's bad written, it's a T instead of the L. So principle irresponsibility is simply the idea that a subject is supposed to be an arbitrary prince. A subject is not bounded by the series of its past choices or behaviors. I take examples to make it clearer, also because I like the examples. For example, when you go every morning into a coffee house where you order your breakfast, or maybe you come in the middle in the afternoon, and maybe each time you order a beer, and maybe such and such beer, but not. I don't want to do any advertisement, so I don't choose the name of the beer. But then it happens, I've done that a lot of times, and it happens that the waiter or the waitress at some point tells you, as usual, and then comes the name of the beer. But waiter or waitress is wrong, because as subject, you could change at any time, at any point. And it's part of our understanding of a subject that he's not bound. He or she may always change. And we know that with the food we claim we like. You know, usually we say, For example, I very much like herrings, or I very much like I don't know, beans or things like that. And we say that during 10 years or 15 years. And then for some strange reason, we are completely unable to explain the love for herrings or for beans dies in us. And we feel suddenly that we are disgusted. The next herrings or the next beans would be unbearable. So we change, we decide that we don't like that. And from now on, we are going to refuse it. And in the beginning, it's difficult because friends, they have prepared that for you. But then they adapt. And again, at some point, we know that to be a subject, it means that we have no explanation to give.
We decide, so the desire for herring dies, and then you decide you don't like it?
I think nobody knows. That's the point. We don't know. Then we are going maybe to rationalize, we say. Progressively, I couldn't stand, it was too salty, and so I don't know. But then it's not true. We have the feeling that it's a kind of change of perspective, and we came from duck to rabbit, and we don't understand why.
My point was it's below decision. The difference with Sartre, for example, it's something that would happen below the kind of...
But my point would be...
Project.
No, it's an important point, you're right, but I would not say categorically that it's below decision, because we may also feel it as decision, but we don't know if it's decision or below decision. And it doesn't matter. It's the new fact of the prince. And same with who we love. And if I see love from the point of view of the ethos of subject, from the point of view of the solicitor of subject, quite different if I see it from the point of view of the solicitor of love, which is also a solicitor in my 2007 book. But if I look at love from the point of view of the solicitor of subject, so from the point of view of the laws of subject, of the table of the laws of subject, then you love someone, and then suddenly you don't love that person anymore. And you have no explanation to give again. So here the best example would be Russell, if I remember well, because sometimes he's having a stroll on his bike, and he realizes that he doesn't love his wife anymore. So he turns back and he's going to tell her. So you see, it goes far beyond Russell, and Russell could be a woman, and so. But for us, also, it's part of the law of subjectivity that you may change your love, and at some point you don't have to explain. And a last point, which is more difficult to argue, but I think it's the same. You may also radically change your politics, and people do so. And usually they rationalize. They pretend that they are right now and they were wrong before, and so on, or the contrary. But at some level, I think that we all know that a subject comes with some politics, and a subject as subjects may very well change their politics as they want. So you understand that subjectivity unfolds a way of turning to the past, and we are free to diverge from our past. And it doesn't mean that we diverge from our past as reification, because if you read Sartre or Heidegger, you find a notion of ipseity, which means that you are always going to negate what you were, because what you were has become a thing, let us take the language of Sartre. It's en soi. It's not so. Being a pour soi, you have to negate it, And here it's not the idea. You diverge not from your reification, but your past as your freedom. It's your very freedom that you are, from which you want to free yourself. You are, or at least from which you have the right to free yourself. And you have as well the right to confirm. Same arbitrary premise. I didn't change. And for example, I know that Alain Krivine, who was a Trotskyist in '68, when he last time he was interviewed, he said, "I didn't change my politics," and he was very proud to say so. And it's the same. He's free not to change. And then we have the injunction of what I call meta-life. And so what I have in mind is that as subject, we feel future as part of our job description. Future is our job. And so I'm going to take an example to try to make that clear. It's a personal example, and it's a strong memory for me. I was teaching in Lille. I was professor of philosophy in Lille, and with some friends. So I was living in Paris. So I was coming on Wednesday and coming back on Thursday. So I spent one night in Lille, Wednesday evening, and I was trying to have fun. And one of the ways to have fun was to organize a bridge evening, a bridge session. So it was very difficult to find three friends and possibly three philosophers to play bridge with, but sometimes we managed to. And so once we were supposed to meet at a colleague's flat to have our bridge evening. And I went out at the station Mairie de Lille, not very important, but and I was supposed to buy the drinks for the evening, a very important part of the evening. And so I remember I was on one side of the street and I saw a supermarket on the other side of the street. And the house of my friend was on the side I was already in, of the same street. So I began to anticipate the structure of the ongoing time. So I had to cross the street, to go inside the supermarket, to find the good drinks, to buy them, to pay the cashier, to go out, cross again, and then come back to the flat. And I realized that it was a very happy evening for me. I liked these friends. I liked very much to play bridge with them. So it was supposed to be a great joy. But I was only in the burden of realizing that structure with all these steps. And how could life have turned into what I call meta-life, where you don't live, you just build the structure of the future, build the sequence. And this sequence is already filled. You know what is going to come in each box of the structure, into each box. And so I think this is...
You decided not to go then?
No, I did it. I did it. And so I think this is the typical way of relating to future of the subject as follower of the sollicitator of subject. And in both cases, in the case of irresponsibility and in the case of meta-life, I think it's connected with the task of identity. Because when principle of irresponsibility shows that identity task incites you to take again and again control of identity, even against its own path. So it means that because your way of relating to past is dominated by task of identity, then you have to be allowed to take control again, which means re-choosing, not only using your acquired choice. And principle of meta-life, it means that your future has to be the realm of expansion of your identity. an identity you invent, which is your task. And so, as you have any way to take control of this future as the realm of your identity, you begin to build it and to imagine its structure and anticipate the feeling of that structure. So that's the way I see these two temporalizations, one towards the past, one towards the future, as they are part of the game of subjectivity, but they are also maybe secretly governed by the task of identity. It's very important to understand that both irresponsibility and meta-life may be disobeyed. It's not funny to play the game of subjectivity. Most of us, we stick to it. Even if we are super Deleuzian philosophers, we are trying to make sense of some identity beyond all these incompatible episodes of what we went through and did. But it's possible to disobey. I mentioned some way of disobeying. For example, we may dive into the eternal present of consumption. It's very bad scene since '68, but we do that very often. We forget about future and past, and we only think in terms of the next thing to buy. And you may live that way, and it's quite pleasant. Another way of forgetting of the game of subject is to dive into the disconnected adventures on the internet. So you spend your time surfing on the internet. And we know people who really are out of time because they are always under the water, the deep water of the sites. Also, there is the way of choosing enjoyment. So again, I cite it in French because it's part of my youth, and I'm not sure I know how to translate it well. So we were saying that our revolution, one of its goals was vivre sans temps mort et jouir sans entrave. So to spend your life without dead intervals, empty intervals, and enjoying without limits, without barriers. So, if you really do that, it's very dangerous. Usually, if you try to do that, you die after 1 month or 2. But when you do that, more or less, you forget the ethos of subjectivity. You don't have any problem of irresponsibility or meta-life anymore. You stop acting as a follower of the call of subject. So I finish with a non-standard feature of that time. It's from the point of view of task of the ethos of subject. There is no present. We relate to past and we relate to future, but we don't relate to present. And I think it's because identity always means embracing identity. So the issue of identity only makes sense with respect to past and future. So here it's funny because we meet in a completely different atmosphere. Zeno's argument of the arrow, because you know, arrow? Arrow. I should know because of the series, the TV show. So you know that the arrow doesn't move because there is no place enough for the arrow to move inside the instant. So it's a little bit like that. There is no present because there is no place for identity inside of the present. So that's everything I had to tell you.